Have you ever been injured? What's the worst injury you have had, and how did it affect you? How did you handle it? And what did you learn? I think injuries are one of the best ways to refocus on what's important in life and ask some of the really big questions. This can be a time of deeper self reflection and open up other opportunities. So, in order to do this, you need to be willing to accept the situation that you're in and to get creative. So, I personally have had many serious injuries. I've had 3 orthopedic surgeries, one for my shoulder slap tear, and 2 for my knee ACL repairs. Each of those taking me out of climbing for at least 6 months up to a year. And I've had so many ankle sprains that I can't even count. And the same goes for hamstring strains. I've had several pulley injuries and elbow tendonitis. And most recently, I've had an injury due to a nerve injury in my elbow, which took me out of climbing for almost 2 years. Injuries can occur for a lot of different reasons. It could be too much training, it could be from just acute instances. And I believe some folks are just prone to injury, kind of like I am, either because of genetics, maybe the tissue or your tendons aren't stiff enough, or maybe there isn't enough mobility, or maybe you have too much mobility. And especially for women, women have a higher risk of injury just because of the fluctuations in hormones every month. But either way, injuries just kind of suck no matter what. And I think everyone has been injured, and injured enough to a point that has changed your view maybe on life or maybe what it is that you're doing in climbing. So, in today's episode, I want to talk about some of my experiences working through injuries and how I became a better climber after every single major injury that I've had. And I'm going to talk about how to use your time effectively while you're injured so that you can come back to climbing better, and what mental struggles we might face, and how to use climbing as an opportunity instead of a setback. This episode does focus on injuries that you can overcome with rehab. I'm not really going to be talking about injuries that are more traumatic. And just know that this episode is not medical advice. I do want to add that there a disclaimer, as I will be talking about some of my own experiences of suicidal ideation, and some of this content might be triggering. And in the same vein, I hope that this content helps those who feel lost in life after a major injury happens. All right, so let's begin first with my best advice possible. Once you get injured, please see a specialist. I am not a specialist, but much of my education was in rehab and return to sport. So my goal is really to bridge an athlete from rehab into performance. Climbers who tend to ignore their pain and think that they can get around their injuries without seeing a specialist often prolong their recovery time. Some of these climbers end up injuring themselves far worse and then have to take significant time off from climbing and can't climb at all. So before even thinking about implementing the advice that I'm giving here, make sure you see a specialist. If you're in the Seattle area, I do want to give a shout out to my favorite PTs. That's Union PT or Move Mend for any climbing specific injuries that you might have. Okay, so before I go into other specifics or any kind of practical information of how to get better, I do want to touch on the mental side of injuries, because by far, an injury that affects your ability to climb can feel disastrous and is more challenging, like the mental side is more challenging to deal with sometimes than the actual injury itself. So for me, climbing is a huge part of my identity. It's my community, it's my support system, it's also my job. And in the past, with a lot of my big injuries, it didn't really affect my mental state. Looking back, I was pretty stubborn and knew that the surgeries and recovery was temporary, and I would have no problem returning to climbing just as strong, and if not stronger. And that was absolutely true with each one of those circumstances. But this last injury really threw me into a new mental state. And as I prepared for this podcast, I really had to reflect on why this was so different. Um, so I did want to share a little bit more extensively because I know that I don't really share a lot of my personal experiences on this podcast or just in any of my content. So I did want to take a little bit more time here and try to give you a deeper look into how this most recent injury affected me. So in October 2022, I started to feel a burning sensation in my elbows. And this was after a really great session at the gym. Previously, I had been feeling a little bit of elbow pain, and that, I think that came from a lot of like neck stiffness. I was sleeping in a van on some weird pillows, and I was traveling a lot. So the pain in my elbows wasn't necessarily new at this point, but this new sensation of kind of a burning, tingling, this was happening in both of my elbows at the same time. And I was like, okay, this kind of maybe seems like some elbow tendonitis. So I'm just going to treat it like elbow tendonitis. I'm going to drop the volume and intensity and basically rehab for tendonitis. But unfortunately, it was actually just getting worse and worse to the point that I couldn't hold a water bottle in my right hand and I couldn't even hold a plate of food. So I knew that, okay, this was bad. But I wasn't super worried. I just figured I would make an appointment with a PT that I trusted to get a diagnosis and start figuring it out. But why didn't I go to a PT first? Okay, why did I not take my advice that I just gave you for the opening of this podcast? Well, it's because the PTs that I trust, they don't take my insurance. And so that means having to pay out of pocket. And I knew that I was going to be doing at least 10 sessions of PT. And I just kind of knew I didn't really have the cash at that point. However, once I started feeling these sensations in my elbows, I just decided, you know what, my body is way more important than anything else. So I'm going to bite the bullet and get it done and just get a diagnosis. So I know what I was going to have to deal with after that diagnosis. So essentially, I got diagnosed with a nerve injury. I hurt my medial nerve. I basically felt a lot of weakness, a lot of pain, tingling at the base of my ring finger and all the way up through my armpit. It's, at this point, I wasn't worried with the diagnosis. I'm like, okay, this is fine. I was mostly just frustrated that I hadn't gone to PT right when I started feeling elbow pain, which was about 3 months prior to that. And, I could have started this process a lot sooner. However, once I got the diagnosis and I got the protocol for rehabbing this nerve injury, the recovery was taking a lot longer than I had anticipated. Like, this was really slow. I could barely crimp without pain. And because I do so much in my life, it was very difficult to avoid pissing off that nerve. Even going for a run, it hurt my elbow. And if I lifted anything, it hurt. So finding movements that didn't hurt was actually a really big challenge because the pain started to feel really hot and it felt really deep in my brain. It made sleeping really difficult for me. And I think it also heightened the pain that I felt in my lower back. I have had chronic back pain since I was a teenager, and I can mostly manage it in my life. But in this instance, it really seemed to turn that pain louder. So all of this basically led to an overall decrease in my activity level. I felt like I couldn't do anything without experiencing pain. And I started to get irritable, agitated. I started binge eating more to deal with kind of this emotional state that I was feeling. And I started to just kind of spiral about my life. I kind of got to a place where I I thought this was just not really going to change. Like, this was months of feeling very little progress in my rehab. And I kind of thought maybe I was never really going to climb as hard ever again. Um, and maybe I wouldn't be able to climb without pain again. And I was getting pretty sad. Um, I felt like I couldn't really lean on the climbing community during this time either. It felt like the folks that I was climbing with thought I was being kind of a weenie. Like, again, this is my perspective. This might not be actually what they were thinking. Um, but there were comments of like, why wouldn't I just go outside and climb just even a little bit? Like, why not just go to the gym and climb a little bit? Um, and I couldn't go outside because even just wearing a pack hurt my elbow. Um, and I even reached out to some experts in the community who are, rehab specialists, and I got some pretty bad advice for my rehab. So in the end, it just felt like I wasn't being heard or seen by my own community. And to add to this mental turmoil that I was in, I was also transitioning away from coaching competitive climbers. They take a lot of work to coach, and honestly, they're quite fickle and they don't pay as much as a regular client. So the stress of having to manage their competitive schedule and all of their training, it just wasn't enough. It was very stressful. And deciding to move away from this area, or moving away from coaching this specific population, felt actually really bad. Like I was giving up on this type of coaching. It felt like I just wasn't, good enough anymore as a coach, even though I was choosing to work with folks who brought me more joy in my job. It somehow felt like I was betraying myself by transitioning away. So I wasn't climbing. I was barely working out. I wasn't coaching elites anymore. I wasn't getting the support from my climbing buddies. I kind of felt like I was in a void. Like, I felt super alone. I felt like I was going through imposter syndrome. Like, how can I even be a coach right now? Because I can't even climb. And if I didn't coach anymore, how the hell was I going to make any kind of money? Like, what jobs could I do that would bring me just as much satisfaction? And I didn't really know who I was without climbing. Like, what was my worth? What was my value? And I had a really hard time coming up with answers to these questions. I felt like I was basically being hit with waves of overwhelm, and that it was pushing me further and further into like a darkness. I for sure sank into a depression. I basically lost hope that my injury would get any better. And I believed that I just kind of sucked as a human. And so this led to suicidal ideation, really thinking about how I could leave this life behind, because that would be much easier than what I was living right now. All I wanted to do was be free of the pain, free of expectations, free of other people's judgments, and honestly, just free of myself. Yeah. And so just, I had a therapist. I had been seeing a therapist for many years, and yeah, she was definitely worried about me during this time. But she just tried to help me focus on the things that I could control. And what brought me back to reality in those moments of absolute darkness was, my wife Brenda and my dog Muppet. Like, I didn't want to leave them or hurt them in any way. And then that brought me to thinking about my clients. And then I thought about my friends, and I basically was able to bring myself out of those harmful thoughts. And so this was a cycle, it was a cycle that lasted several months. And mostly I just tried to ignore my thoughts and disassociate from what I was feeling by watching a ton of movies and watching TV shows. I did dabble in some art. I used to be an artist for a long time, when more in my teens and into my 20s. And I was also a musician. And so I thought, you know what, maybe this is a good time to go back to that a little bit. And I did do some drumming, but unfortunately the drumming was hurting my elbows. So I did a little bit, just to get some of that movement, and it felt good. But I couldn't do much of it. During this time, I was also very diligent about my rehab. I'm really good at doing my homework, so I wasn't worried about not showing up for my rehab. And I could tell after, several months that I was getting a little bit better. Like, there was a tiny little bit of progress. And these tiny little milestones opened up more movements. I was able to start benching again. So because it was a more of a pressing movement, it didn't really aggravate that elbow as much if I kept the range pretty short. I was also able to start doing some light lifting because I found these metal cups that you can attach to your hands. They're basically the shape of your hand, and it helps you hold heavy things in your hands. And that was a great little thing that I found. And shout out to Sam from Movement, who recommended these cups for me, because I was able to deadlift and hold dumbbells. And so this was amazing for me. Like, the moment that I could start feeling some intensity in my body, like I was working towards something, I feel like things started to change. Now, I still couldn't really run, so I decided to double down on my lifting. And really, like, the lifting felt like meditation to me. Like, it really brought me into the present moment. Because after months of depression, I gained weight. I hardly did any kind of movement. This felt like a little window of opportunity, and this opportunity felt like a gift. I literally felt like I was alive again, even though I wasn't lifting super heavy. It was just enough to bring me into that present moment, and it allowed me to think about these bigger questions that I just couldn't answer previously. Basically, I was grateful to have a body. I was grateful that this fleshy sack had a nervous system and a brain, that I could use to experience life with. And as my pain got better and better, I was actually able to start climbing. And this was absolutely amazing. This was like, I remember the first time I went to the gym and climbed V0s, it was a totally different experience. It was like I had a pair of, like, maybe I took a pair of goggles off. Things felt lighter. I was fully enjoying climbing. And this is what brought me to remembering why I like to climb. And it's because I love the movement. I think the movement is really what brings me into my body the best out of anything out there, that I've ever tried. Climbing is what brings me into the present moment the best. And I also got to the point where I was okay with not climbing hard again. Like, if I never climbed hard again, I was okay with it. So I think really what happened after this whole process, and still being in pain, is that I got to a point of gratitude, of acceptance, and letting go of my own expectations as a climber. I let go of grades. I let go of my perceived pressures. And if easy climbing was all I could do, I was happy with that. And just know that this didn't happen instantly. Like, this was a process that took many months. I wish it was something that I just woke up and woo, now I'm grateful. No, that's not how it worked for me. I think just like day by day, it just got a little bit better and a little bit better. And it's really just that process. Um, yeah, and the feeling of freedom that I feel now about my climbing is pretty amazing. And I think this is the biggest lesson that I've learned from this injury, um, is that it doesn't really matter how hard I climb. What matters most is how I feel about myself and in my body. And right now, though, so this, it's been just over 2 years or 2.5 years. Um, I'm finally back to climbing pretty hard. I still feel pain from time to time, and I know how to manage it. I still, I'm actually still going to PT to make sure that if anything flares up, I can talk to my PT, talk through it, maybe make any changes to either like the intensity or the volume that I'm doing, but mostly what exercises I can do to keep me put together. So yeah, I'm just very excited to be climbing the way that I'm climbing right now. I've been able to go outside. Yeah, I'm just very, very excited. So while this injury was really no different to my other injuries, like my shoulder injury, my ACL tears, somehow the timing of this injury and the nature of this injury really affected my mindset. But I'm really glad that this happened. And I'm glad that I dipped myself into the acid and came out different. I am changed forever because of this injury. Yeah, and really in the end, I'm really grateful. So I do hope that I can continue to feel this way. I can feel myself being pulled a little bit by the grades. I want to see where I'm at right now and how far I can go. I'm 42, right? Like I'm turning 42 next month. And I still think that I can climb harder than I did a couple years ago. But I think the reason for climbing hard is very different than it used to be. It's more out of a curiosity right now rather than a thing that I have to do because of my job or because of how many people know who I am and the expectations that created a prison for me. So yeah, that's my story. Thank you for listening to that. So I do want to go into some practical tips on how to use injury as a means to opportunity rather than a setback. So let's start with the top 5 mental tips. And my number one, after seeing a PT, of course, okay, is try to find acceptance around your injury. And acceptance isn't easy, but it is a clear path to mental flexibility. And accepting means that you're not blaming yourself for getting injured. You're not ruminating on what could have been, what you should have done, what you could have avoided, etc. Accepting that injury is part of any sport or physical activity that you do on a regular basis. And often we are the ones that get in the way of feeling better physically and mentally. And this is something I fully learned during my process. So yes, it sucks to be injured. And this is also a really great time to try to ask yourself some of these bigger questions. Even if you don't have the answer to them, just asking these questions could put you in a mindset of reflection. So why do you love climbing? Why are you doing this? What role does climbing play in your life? And it also sets the stage for other aspects in your life. What have you been neglecting that you could focus on while you recover? What can you be grateful for in this moment? And as part of acceptance, having a few weeks or a few months off of climbing won't affect your climbing skill development long term. When you think of the grand scheme of things, if climbing is your lifelong sport, taking a few weeks or a few months off, or in my case, a few years, It's not going to change your climbing ability. Most of us have injuries that we can fully recover from, but mostly it's the mental state that we need to fully recover from in order to continue to see improvement in climbing. All right, so number two, the second tip is trusting the process and trusting that the injury is temporary. We are, as humans, we are in constant change. Nothing is ever the same. Nothing ever stays the same. No matter how much you try to control life, it's not going to stay the same. So that means you're going to go through periods of no injuries and no pain, but then you will experience pain and injury at other points in life. And if you're injured right now, trust that you will get better, that you will overcome the pain, and the pain is going to change. The body is very smart and it will adapt to what you're doing. The third tip is finding gratitude with what your body is capable of in this moment. Our bodies and brains are truly amazing, and it's only when something is taken away that we realize how much we rely on a functioning body. All right, tip number 4 is, it relates to pain. I wrote this really weirdly. If you can't be trusted with your own pain, it's best to consult with a PT or a coach to get you on a program. So pain is it's a different experience for everyone. And for some, pain is considered a nuisance and it can be easily ignored and easily pushed past. Some folks will keep pushing and pushing and hoping that the pain will just go away. And I'm sure that there's some sort of avoidance here. But try to treat pain as a signal that, hey, there's actually something going on here. And you might want to stop and pay attention to the pain just for a second. And because pain and the experience of pain is different for everybody, the approach might have to be slightly different. And there's the folks on the other end of the spectrum where people might be afraid to push into pain, and they worry a lot about getting injured, and might even have a mindset of like, I never want to be injured, and will avoid a lot of hard things because of the fear of injury. And so these folks tend to not improve and not get stronger. And then there's a spiral of not feeling good enough and not feeling like you're doing enough to progress in your climbing. And I think really in the end, it's just being afraid to feel the pain. And the reality is we are humans, and pain is part of the human experience, both physically and mentally. All right. And the last mental tip that I just want to touch on is to make sure that you're taking a long-term view of your rehab. And if you're trending toward function, that means, is what you're doing helping you or hurting you? Because I'm not a specialist, I will use let pain be your guide. All right. Try to avoid pain as much as possible and talk to your PT about the pain threshold and what the pain threshold means, and what experiences you're having, or that you should be having. So, for example, most PTs that have advised me, they say to stay at a 3 or below out of a scale of 10. And this is the pain scale. So 1 is no pain and 10 is the worst pain you've ever experienced. And so 3 seems to be a good spot to push your tendons, that it gives you enough stimulus to recover the tissue while also allowing your brain to manage that kind of pain. Because 3 is not, it's not super bad. It's a little annoying. You can kind of feel it, but it's not a negative feedback loop for your brain. So make sure that you're tuning your attention to the injured area before, during, and after climbing. Use the pain scale to keep track of your progress. Is your pain getting better or worse? Is it better than yesterday? Is it worse than yesterday? How long does it take for the pain to subside after exercise? And is that pain window decreasing? All right, so let's talk about some physical training tips. The first one is, so if you're injured, you really want to spend a lot of time warming up. So spend more time than you normally would. This is a good time to also tune into the injured area. It may be that all you do that day is warm up because maybe the pain is more than a 3. And if you have finger injuries, I really like finger glides as a great way to introduce full range of motion before getting into any climbing session. And with any of your sessions, especially if it's an upper body injury, even if it's a lower body injury, you want to create a controlled environment for your training. You might not always know what certain holds feel like, and you don't know if a certain hold or move is going to hurt. So you really do have to set up your session so that you can control as many variables as you can. There should always be comfort, and there should be no question of uncertainty. If there is uncertainty, then I would trend toward not doing that climb at all. How do you control these environments? Well, one way is to climb very slowly on very easy climbs and on holds that you're very familiar with. Maybe you can repeat climbs in the gym, or if you're using a training board, you can have your playlist of very easy climbs that you feel comfortable on, and you know that it's not going to hurt anything in your body. And honestly, like, I love training boards. I think it's a really great way to manage injuries, especially if you're familiar with the board. And some exercises that I have been doing for a very long time, especially during injury, are isometric holds. So I choose 1 or 2 holds for my hands. Maybe I keep my feet on the ground and I'm just pulling and holding that tension for 8 to 10 seconds. It's almost like hangboarding. You can also do isometric holds in positions where all 4 points are on the wall, and you can practice Gastons. You can practice diagonal tension where one foot is higher than the other. You could practice heel hooking positions, but it's all isometric. So you're not actually moving in these exercises. You're just holding that position, and you hold it for a set amount of time. And you can do reps and sets of this. And you can track that over time. Maybe you start with only a few sets of a few reps, and then over time you can add 1 more set each week. Make sure that you are avoiding impact. So that means no dynamic moves. That means no falls. Try not to jump. Obviously, it depends on your injury, because any kind of dynamic movement requires a lot of tissue resilience and a lot of tissue tolerance. And most injured areas don't have that. So if you're going to go more dynamic, you really increase your chances of re-injuring that area. You also want to avoid too much volume and intensity. You've probably heard this over and over. So make sure that you work with a PT or a coach to really dial this in. Or if you don't have access to either of those, you can keep a training journal and just count how many attempts that you've taken that day, and keep a log of your pain scale before, during, and after. And then each session you can add an attempt and see how that feels, and then keep adding an attempt each session. You can, I prefer to go with an increase in volume first, and then you can start to increase intensity, only because you can really control volume a little bit more than controlling intensity, at least from my experience. Make sure that you're staying consistent with your rehab and any kind of movement, because movement is medicine. Motion is lotion, as my friend Ryan says. And for me, this was huge. My brain works so much better when my body is moving. Now, probably the biggest tip of all when you're injured is to watch as much climbing as possible. When I tore my ACLs, So I tore one in 1 year, and then literally exactly a year later, I tore the other one. So that was basically that was 2 years in a row of not really climbing as hard as I wanted to. But that whole time, I decided I really want to watch my friends climb, and I had a really great opportunity because the people I was climbing with were very good. So this was, I started climbing in Colorado. Almost everyone there was a pro at the time. You probably would have heard a lot of the names of the people that I was climbing with. And so this was a great opportunity for me. I could watch what people were doing in their technique. I could watch their process of projecting. I could just observe what their character was like when they're approaching certain climbs. And I would say that this was probably the biggest single thing that helped move the needle for me in climbing. Like before tearing my ACLs, I think I had climbed one or two V8s. But after going through the rehab process for 2 years and watching my friends climb, and really noticed a huge uptick in how I was moving. I was stronger because really all I could do was upper body training while my ACLs were rehabbing. But I could just feel the movement in my body so much more because I used the movement that I was seeing and I integrated it into my body by visualizing it. And this was really incredible. So that would be probably the biggest tip that I could give. And the thing that really changed my climbing was watch people, watch how they climb, watch really good climbers, and see if you can integrate that into your body and use some visualization so that you can repeat and practice in your brain when you can't actually do it in real life. So those are my biggest tips for you. I hope that this information helps you if you're injured right now or for the next time that you might get injured. Injuries happen, they're going to happen. You're never going to experience climbing without an injury. So you might as well get really good at dealing with pain in your body, especially as you age. And don't let it scare you. Don't let it hold you back either. Because, like I said, I think that injuries can help us so much to overcome our mental barriers and our physical barriers as well. So if I missed any good tips, please share in the comments. And if you'd like to share your experience of your injury and how you overcame your injury or how you dealt with it, feel free to share in the comments. I would love to hear it. All right, so thank you again, and I'll catch you in the next one.